All right, module 3. Thank you very much for being here today. Today we will dig even deeper in the brain. So pretty much this lecture will be about going from here to here. Right, so we're going to go dig deeper inside the brain. Now, in order to do that, there are a few things that I would like to add. I will add a few slides as I did last week, but also a few added diagrams, and I will add my voice later to the post-production part of the video, simply because it's hard to see and link all those parts simultaneously. So I'll do my best to do everything here live, and then I will add a few more parts so that you'll be better equipped to remember all those areas in the brain. Now, without further ado, let's begin with the definition. So what are we doing in week 3? Well, we are analyzing anatomy as well as physiology. So those two terms almost indicate two sides of the same coin. So on one side, you have the structure. So of course, neuro, or brain, because that's what we're discussing, neuro and or brain anatomy. Okay, so this is the first part, anatomy. Okay, so brain structure, all the parts of the brain. Okay, part 2, because we did a little of that when we went into 2. And the second thing, also neuro or brain, but this time will be physiology. Or function. Right? Okay, so physiology, the first term that I would like to discuss a little bit, is related to nature itself. Now, anatomy is pretty straightforward, it's the structure itself. And of course, it's a Greek compound with a prefix and the core, the stem of the term, which we previously discussed, so we'll not spend too much time on this term. Physiology is related to physis. Okay? So right here, we have two different terms, both of which relate to the body. The previous one that we encountered last week is soma. Okay? And you should remember that from the somatic nervous system. And the other one now is physis. So soma and physis as both terms related to our body, so to speak, but the main difference that in this case, we are dealing with the body itself, and that's how we got the adjective somatic, okay? Somatic, or even better in our context, psychosomatic. So a combination of mind and body. This is connected to the mind and body connection. So mind and body, right? So this is the body. Versus physis is the extended body. It's nature itself, okay? So physis as nature. Nature. So already at this level, we can embark on a philosophical discussion, because physis and nature are two aspects of the same thing, not two sides of the same coin this time. Physis is also related to light, to phos in Greek. So it's nature that blossoms, that enlightens us, that is born again, again, and again. It's the same thing as the Latin equivalent nature, natura naturans, the ever being reborn element. Okay, so nature is something that is by definition alive. Now, physis and soma are connected, so when we study physiology, or rather when we study logos, logic, nature, it means that we're studying the function, how the brain, in this case, comes alive. Okay, so structure, anatomy, all the parts, function, how it comes alive. And that's what we're trying to do today. Okay, so let's begin with a basic diagram. As I mentioned, each week we will repeat some of the things that we encountered the previous one, because I want to make sure that this course will feel like a dialogue with you, especially because it's an online course. And so in a dialogue with any human beings, hopefully, you will not just say one thing, expecting everybody to remember what you just say, but you keep bringing back certain things to see if you can readdress them from different angles, applying different perspectives. So that's what we're trying to do today. So first diagram, we will do the usual thing, okay? So we will see the brain from the side, okay? Okay. Well, let me just add whole thing, the brain, lobes, and spinal cord, okay? Then we will always make sure to add a person to this brain. I always like to do that because it gives some level of, well, this goes as far as it gives some sense of, I don't know, humanity to the conversation. Okay? And we will address those main lobes that we already encountered. Okay, so brain structure in general. Let's start from the big part. Now, I already mentioned that this whole part here is what? You remember? It's the cerebrum. Okay, cerebrum. Okay, so this should already sound familiar to you, right? And what's the little brother, the little sibling? Is the cerebellum right here, okay? Cerebellum. You remember, we already discussed the fact that the cerebellum doesn't get as much attention as it should get, but it has to do with balance, movement, gait, etc., etc. It's very, very much alive with all the functions that are contained therein. Now, these other parts that I want to discuss is the fact that not only is it the cerebrum, but this biggest part here is the forebrain, okay? The forebrain, okay? Forebrain, which has to do with higher function. You could say with rationality in the modern sense of the term. Now, if you also remember, I said that the brain can be interpreted in three main directions: top to bottom, front to back, left to right, with the added outside and inside. So today we will dig deeper into the inside. But in order to do that, it's important to understand that the lower you get, neuroanatomically, neurophysiologically speaking, the closer you get to basal functions. Okay, so respiration, for instance, heart rate, etc., etc. Because the neuroanatomical, neurophysiological reason is that you want to preserve biological life as much as you can. So it makes sense that the part you want to protect the most should be the central part of the brain, should be the part of the brain that is contained by the rest. Not that the higher functioning part are not as important, but the point I'm trying to make here, the point that nature wants to make, is that without breathing, without life, you cannot achieve anything else that's higher, computationally speaking or cognitively speaking, than that. So you want to make sure that these parts are protected. Okay, so midbrain, of course, pons, and medulla oblongata, all of which are here connecting the big brain here to the spinal cord. Again, we are talking about the central nervous system here. One more repetition at this level. Let's add a few things. We will add two main parts here, the cilium fissure, right? So let me just call it SF here. The central sulcus, CS, which we already encountered. And then at this level, I would also like to add these two simultaneously opposite parts, okay? So we are talking about the brain scene itself. If you remember, I already mentioned that the frontal part, right in front of the central sulcus, has to do with what? With, well, a cortex, right? Because the cortex is the bark, it's the outlet of layer. So you should remember that. And if it's in front, it has to do with grandeur, aggression, reaching out, movement. Therefore, this is what? The motor cortex. Okay? I'm sure you remember all of this. It doesn't hurt to repeat motor cortex. Okay? All this part here toward the frontal lobe. And then the backside, neuroanatomically corresponding part. Okay? Right behind the central sulcus is what? So if it's in front is movement, active, reaching out. In the back, you'll have perception. You have passive understanding, introjection, we could even say. So somatosensory cortex, somatosensory cortex, okay? Now, you should still remember there's 4 lobes also because this might or might not be part of few quizzes, right? So frontal lobe here, okay, let's just name it with the initials here, frontal lobe, maybe we should just put the F. Then parietal lobe, so just put a P here, okay, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, okay, and finally, what? Can you see it? No pun intended, occipital lobe, okay? So all those 4 lobes should be still intact. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Not the cerebellum. Okay, don't confuse. With this. Don't confuse occipital lobe with the cerebellum. Here we go. So here is where we are, and of course, each of these has very specific function. If you do remember, I also mentioned broadcast right here and Wernicke on the back, both connected to the way we communicate. So broadcast in front has to do with speech production, and Wernicke right here in the back has to do with language understanding. So the example I made is that if your patient has a stroke, in either of these areas, you will experience something in interaction with your patient that will be determined in cognitive and communication level presentation in very different ways, okay? So word salad, for instance, where each word makes sense, it's understandable, it's pronounced well, there's no accent, and everything is correct in terms of the way it sounds. So you would assume that the broadcast part will not be, the broadcast area will not be affected because again, the words are perfectly pronounced, but they do not make sense. So you can assume that something in the back is not quite right. Okay, word salad, toaster, green, pen, car, etc. Okay? The opposite, okay, where the person is understanding you, is able to interact with you with a higher cognitive function. You can detect that, for instance, by the person's ability to type things, for instance, or point things out, so that rationalization and understanding is intact, so the Wernicke part is not affected, but the person is not able to produce sound. Everything sounds a little bit like a bubbling or animalesque noise that doesn't really make sense according to the expectation from the perspective of human higher functioning. So in that second case, the broadcast area will be the one affected. So there's a lot of things that we can add, but for now, think of all of these things. So forebrain, the midbrain, hindbrain, of course, in the back, cerebrum versus cerebellum, all 4 lobes, the central sulcus as a signal fissure, the motor cortex in front, and the somatosensory cortex in the back. Before we dig deeper, I would like to show you a little image of the best way to describe what's happening up here, okay, right here. So let me clean a little bit this this part here. So, and of course, one thing that I should always mention is, as long as you do remember the terms in one language, preferably an Indo-European language, because that's what we're talking about, you should be all set in terms of what we're trying to do here. So whether you use terms such as forebrain, hindbrain, midbrain, whether you use the term brain itself or you use encephalon, whether you use cerebrum, so respectively English, so Germanic languages, Greek or Roman/Latin language, Italic languages, as long as you can position things and know what they're doing, then you will be all set, okay? So try to make sense of those things. Now, if you will embark on a medical, clinical, neuroscientific career, it's preferable that you can use all these 3 terms interchangeably, because that's what happens in most parts of the world. In fact, for people that also speak other languages from different linguistic families, like Semitic, for instance, they should also know that part. So it's a good exercise to be flexible in that sense. So I was talking about this, and this, the combination, the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, this whole part, okay, It's what we also refer to as the somatosensory map. Sensory map. Okay. Now again, we are talking about two sides of the same coin. Yet again, the example I made is in front, motor cortex, you will find the action, the part of the brain that will lighten up if I'm doing something active. So if I am, again, grabbing this, okay, then I can be able to grab it and hold it, it's right here. But as soon as I hold it, I will have afferent neurons that go back to my brain, and right here, they will tell me what's going on, all right? So it's kind of feedback mechanism. The somatosensory map, somatosensory cortex here and motor cortex here also give rise to what we call, and this is a term that I really would like you all to remember, this term is proprioception. Proprioception, okay? Not perception, okay? Not perception, okay, which we discussed before. So perception in general is the ability to understand something with a purpose. You remember, per plus ception, grasping something, understanding something. So anything can be perceptual, so to speak, sensory-based perception. I can perceive things with my eye, I can perceive things with my ears, and so on and so forth. Proprioception, okay, proprio as in the, let me put it this way, the self in space, okay? So is the perception, the understanding of myself in space. It's how the body sees itself, is the way the brain modulates things in a map so I can understand what's going on. And there's a variety of fascinating neuroscientific studies that indicate that. I will post some of those studies in the description below as well in the commentaries, simply because it's fascinating. And rather than me talking about those studies, it's really good for you to observe. So some of the studies indicate, for instance, that our body it's shaped by what's inside, and it's also shaping what is inside. In other words, I identify myself with my body because I tend to assign a value to my body. But also the other way around. It's a common mistake to think that I am completely detached from my body. I observe my body, and the body does not say anything back to me, so to speak. Now, this detachment can be useful, for instance, in the context of meditation, spirituality, transcendental practices, where you don't want to assign too much power and weight to your body. You want to detach yourself from the body. This is also extremely useful when you're in pain, in physical pain, so you don't become overwhelmed by physical pain. You want to separate yourself from the body. In fact, something that you can try right away, if you are, let's say you're suffering from, I don't know, something mild, I don't know, there's a, you hit yourself and there's a little pain here. If you try not to think about the pain at first, then you will see that the pain will decrease, okay? If instead you're trying to focus on the pain and you rehearse the pain interiorly, then you will see that the pain will actually feel magnified in its nature. It feels more hurtful. Now, of course, this is not a black and white situation, because you can also make the opposite claim, whereby if you're trying your best to completely detach from the brain, and then you have this inner voice telling you, you're not doing it right, the pain is still there, then you will end up magnifying the pain because you're not able to detach yourself. It's the same situation where a person might not be prone to sit for an hour in a meditative practice because you become, anxious and jittery, you want to move around. But the other thing is this, that proprioception also allows you to understand where your boundaries are. So one of these examples, one of the studies that I mentioned earlier, had to do with monkeys that will extend their proprioceptive mechanism if you give them a stick, for instance. So the stick, the item, the object that they will carry becomes an extension of their body, right? So the brain cell perceives this no longer as a completely separate entity. So the brain will perceive this one as one way if it's right here, and in a completely different way if it's me holding it, okay? And so if I am trying to move my hand around, this will become an extension, proprioceptively speaking, of my arm in this case. The example that I usually give, I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, is when you're trying to park in reverse and with a car. Now, you know full well that the body of the car, it's not your own body. Even for someone like me that loves cars, it's not the same thing as you. But if you're about to scratch the back, you look back, you almost get, ouch, ouch, I'm going to scratch it. You know full well that you might not get hurt if you drive, hopefully very slowly, but it becomes an extension. And this is not just a metaphor, that's the point I'm trying to make. The brain sees that as an extension of yourself. Now, when we will discuss pathological elements, we will embark on clinical psychology, this will be an essential part to understand how the proprioceptive mechanisms work to address physical pain and, even more importantly, psychological, emotional pain. When we will not be able to recognize ourselves in the mirror, we understand that that's our reflection, but we can only reflect about what we can see. That is not me, and this has a variety of applications. For instance, when we think about bulimia or anorexia nervosa, or disorder of sexual development, disorders of identity, dissociative features. It's a variety of things which we'll discuss again with 10, 11, so on and so forth. But for now, keep in mind that this is the proprioception area of the brain, the way the brain sees itself. Another important area is how you can fool your brain in order to have some benefit from it. And possibly one of the best examples is the examples of phantom limb syndrome. Okay, so I will just write here, phantom limb syndrome, phantom limb syndrome. Now there is some debate in neuroscience whether this should be considered a syndrome or a disorder, but for now, let's call it phantom limb problem, right? And the name is pretty self-explanatory, is the fact that you might feel pain or itchiness, or any other somatosensory element in a limb that's no longer there. For instance, you might have had an accident and you no longer have the index finger, for instance, but you see that the tendency to, I don't know, pick up a cigarette and smoke, and the cigarette will fall down. Now, part of that is just muscle memory. We understand that, and you're full well aware that the finger is not there. But phantom limb is more than that. Is having the perception that something is there and it's itching, despite the fact that the limb is no longer there, even if the whole limb is missing. This is something that's been discussed and studied for decades, especially with veterans, missing limbs due to being deployed and having had a very serious accident that took a very heavy toll on their body, so they're missing a limb. And one of the most fascinating studies, a study that was able to remove this itchiness, this pain, almost instantaneously, by using a mirror, nothing too technological, just a mirror, a box, cardboard box or a wood box with a mirror inside, so that the person was able to put the hand that was still there, looking at the reflection. Okay, the brain was fooled into believing the reflection was actually the missing limb, the missing hand in this case, the left one. And by moving the hand and kind of stretching it out, the brain was self-convincing that this other hand was no longer itching. It's a fascinating study, it's a fascinating application of proprioceptive knowledge. And one of the neuroscientists that studied this in depth is Vilayanur Ramachandran, Vijay Ramachandran. So I will really, really encourage you to take a look at his studies. And again, I will include some of that in the description below. So one more thing about this fascinating thing. There is an image that I love that really does a good job in describing the somatosensory map. This image is called the homunculus, or little cute man, as in human being. Okay, so let's write here, homunculus. Okay. And I will add the little image right here so you can see what I'm talking about. One image is the homunculus that, as you can see, it's very cute, it's very fascinating, and what it does, it describes how things are perceived by the brain. Now you see that there are certain parts that are much bigger, so they're not matching real proportions, and all of those areas, as you would expect, have to do with the areas that have a better understanding of physiological stimulation or sensory motor simulations of all our senses. So you'll see that our hands will be magnified, and to some extent our feet as well, our eyes, our ears, our mouth, especially the lips, and the tongue will be magnified because we have a lot of sensory capacity in those areas to give us information about the world we live in, okay? And those sensory information are also modulated by an enhanced appreciation for that stimulation due to neuroreceptors in those areas. So the precision, the number, the structure gives us all more information. So it makes more sense that our ears, for instance, will be much bigger in proprioceptive terms in comparison to our elbows, for instance. You can also do this as a little example. If you grab, let's say, 2 pens, and I have a second one here, or you ask a friend to have 2 ballpoint pens, and you put them really, really close to one another, and you start to gently touch the other person. I said gently, please do not puncture or poke. Just gently touch the other person, and you ask the person how they feel. Now, if they already know what's going on, of course, that is really not a true double-blind experiment. It would be preferable if the person did not know what you're doing, and yet, it's really hard not to make that claim. So what you're doing to my body. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you just 2 pens very close to one another, and you touch them, let's say here or here, immediately you feel this is 2 separate pens, even if they're very, very close, okay? But if you touch them, let's say, on your knee or on your elbow, it's really hard not to feel as if it was just 1 pen touching you, right? And this is due to the differences in proprioceptive factors at the level of the part of the body that's being touched upon, okay? Now, I'm only mentioning touch, all right? So, of course, what I mentioned already a few weeks ago is that there are specific areas of the brain responsible for that. So if I'm saying things such as light, touch, temperature, and pain, which of these will be the part of the brain involved? 3, 2, 1. Of course, yes, right here, parietal lobe, right? And that makes sense because the parietal lobe is literally attached to the somatosensory mouth, so it makes sense also intuitively. So the homunculus shows all of that. Not only that, but it also shows that our genital areas are also magnified structure for the same reason in terms of proprioceptive stimulation, but also because they contain an added feature. And I always mention this, that the nervous system and the endocrine system hormones are always in communication. And when we're talking about things such as the pituitary gland and the pineal gland, and the thalamus, the hypothalamus, you'll see how those things all come together. So again, proprioceptive map, somatosensory map, motor cortex, somatosensory cortex. Of course, you see all the corresponding mechanisms. So the map is applicable to both the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, my left and my right, of course, to his views was the other way, but on both sides of the brain, okay? Which also means that the 2 hemispheres are not quite the same. And if you remember the experiment by Desan Gazzaniga, you know that one side of the brain is more figurative, creative, imaginative, creating images, which is the right hemisphere, versus the left hemisphere is more to do with interpretation, language, math, etc., etc. Now, please do not take this as a black and white situation. Several studies have indicated that integration is the key, all right? So when we think about the corpus callosum, integrating both hemispheres, you can develop one skill starting from a very, very different angle, an angle, in fact, that should belong to the opposite hemisphere. For instance, if you want to become better at math, study music, okay? And you might argue, well, of course, music is predicated upon mathematical structures, the notes and the structure and the chords and the distance and the semitones. But the same applies to painting, okay? You want to become better at physics, start to paint. So the more integration you have, the better it is. So I think now it's time to dig deeper in our brain. So from the somatosensory map and all these fascinating areas, we will go a little deeper, and we shall perhaps use this as a model, but we'll also superimpose other brain diagrams to make things a little easier to understand. All right, so Clean up. Great. Now, this picture is really not to scale, so that the camera is not really positioned well today, but okay. So we will delete the outside, okay? Right here. Yeah, I will probably do maybe a little reprise of the overall page. Okay, right here. And now we will superimpose the central part of the brain. So imagine now there is a little section of the brain. So I'm cutting the brain in half, following the structure of the corpus callosum. So I'm separating the right from the left hemisphere. And now, because we are looking in this direction, I am removing the left hemisphere. So we look into the half of my brain toward the right hemisphere. That's where we are located now. So already here, we will start with this structure first. All right, okay. And see how that happens. So I will add a few descriptions afterwards, but this is probably the best way. In fact, actually, let me do this. Okay, so separation, identify the limbic system here. All right, so just to review what we said so far. We're looking at this brain diagram, and there is, the central nervous system that is the part of the nervous system we will focus on for now, despite the fact that I already mentioned that the proprioceptive mechanism have to do with reaching out to the peripheral nervous system, but the central part is connected to the brain center. So the brain is connected to the spinal cord through the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So one thing that we should remember is that the midbrain, which is also the mesencephalon, right? Remember that we talked about that when talking about the Greek roots of the brain. So midbrain or mesencephalon, we're talking about the same thing, and it's very complex, like everything else in the brain, and has a range of neuron clusters, so colliculi and nuclei, and other structures, neural pathways, et cetera, to facilitate multiple functions. So you have movement, hearing, understanding how the environment and space works. So we calculate and filter out responses, and also contains very, very important the substantia nigra, which you probably heard before because it's where dopamine is located. It's very rich in the dopamine neurons. And it's also an area affected by Parkinson's disease. So it's also part of the basal ganglia, which of course has to do with coordination, movement, etc. Now the pons is the origin for 4 of the 12 cranial nerves. And as you can probably imagine, just because of the structure and the location of the pons, which again means the bridge, it has to do with things such as blinking, chewing, tear production, as well as hearing and facial expression. In general, keep this in mind. The sensory motor function had to go through these parts of the central nervous system and then go up to the cortex to be understood and magnified, right? And finally, the medulla, which is the bottom of the brain stem. Okay, it's the connection between the brain and the spinal cord when they meet. All right. So again, heart rhythm, respiration, breathing, blood flow, oxygenation, as well as carbon dioxide levels. All of that are here. So is the medulla an essential part? Of course, because whether you're sneezing or vomiting, or basic functions such as swallowing or coughing, for instance, all those functions are related to your existence, your biological existence, that is. So again, this is a fascinating and very, very important concept. When we talk about going from top to bottom, bottom up, and we talk about afferent neurons and afferent neurons and pathways, afferent nerves and efferent nerves, what we said is that you need to have a filter that magnifies things. So whatever is happening out here, my limbs, my function, my internal organ, etc., has to go through the spinal cord. And here, this part here is where everything is filtered, amplified, and understood. Not just once, but everything is modular here for survival. And as soon as it reaches the cortex, imagine this, that the limbic system, the thalamic structure, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus are somewhat like a computer that projects information on the cortex, and is exactly where things are understood to be there. So this is also connected with consciousness and awareness. We know that something exists if we feel, perceive, know, because of all of this, that it exists. So everything has to be filtered there. But let's continue with the central part of the brain in our diagram. All right, so we dig deeper, and of course, the brain itself has to be protected from the outside world. So you do have the meninges, which has these layers of prosthetic cover. There are three layers. You have the dura mater, or strong, hard matter, right, which is thick and tough, and the arachnoid matter, which, of course, as an implies, has to do with this, I don't know, spider web-like connective tissue, right, without nerves and blood vessels, and probably the pia mater, the pious matter, which is the thin membrane that covers, that wraps, that hugs the surface of the brain, and it's rich with veins and arteries. So again, dura mater, very thick, with a proprioceptive layer, and which lines the inner dome of the cranium of your skull, and the meningeal layer, which is right below that. And of course, there's space between these two layers, which will allow for veins and arteries to go through and supply blood flow to the brain. Without that, the brain cannot function. That's why blood flow is so important, and that's why, can I say this, how blood provides nutrients as well as oxygenation, which are essential for neurological function. Then you have the arachnoid matter, which is much thin, again, like a web, right? And below that, you have the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, also extremely important. Okay, what does the CSF do? It captures the entire CNS and keeps circulating around the structure to remove impurities. And finally, as we mentioned, you have the pia mater, rich with arteries and veins. And now we go a little deeper. We go deeper into the structure inside the brain, as the diagram indicates. So we have a variety of things that are shown here. So again, right around the big part, you have the whole cerebral cortex, right? And I should mention that the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex really are about 1/3 of the whole cortex. So they really play a significant parts of brain functions. Now, size, it's not everything in the brain. There's plenty of studies that indicates, for instance, that other mammals, other primates have much bigger brains than us. So it's not just the overall size that determines higher functional intelligence. Overall, for instance, male subjects have much bigger brains than female subjects, but that has no bearing to IQ levels, for instance. It's the percentage and the relative structure and function and size that really matters, not the overall size of the brain. But nevertheless, that part of the brain really occupies about 1/3 of the whole cortex. In any case, the cerebral cortex has to do with rational thinking, with planning ahead, with thought. Then you have the basal ganglia, which of course have to do with movement and another type of planning that's more spatial, so motor planning. And very, very importantly, they have to do with rewards, the reward system in the brain, okay? Which is interesting because really connected, toward the frontal part of the brain with, veto powers and understanding of what we would qualify as ethical or moral elements, so the reward system. Then, of course, you have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus. Thalamus is this Greek word that has to do with this inner part, with the bed, okay? So what you can lay on and rest, so to speak. So the thalamus has to do with seeing, hearing, sensory gateway. The hypothalamus, the smaller one, the one below, has to do with regulation of body functions and motivational behaviors, initiating behaviors, not necessarily in a movement level, but as the name implies, with the motivation itself. And of course, you have the hippocampus that is essential for the formation of memories and biographical memories appreciated as well. And then the other part that I feel we should really discuss more in depth is the so-called master gland, the pituitary gland, which of course is the connection of the body as a whole and the regulation of the flow of hormones from thyroid, adrenals, ovaries, and testicles, which of course is not a true master gland because it receives chemical signal from the hypothalamus through its stomach and blood supply. So master gland, yes, and yet again, it's still depending on the work of the hypothalamus, which is right above the pituitary gland and regulates body temperature, has to do with sleeping patterns, hunger and thirst as well. Some element of emotion production and attention, and memory. Now, because we mentioned emotion, the amygdala or amygdala, there are two inside, the word means almond in Greek. They're located under each half of the brain, so under each hemisphere of the brain, right there, and they are indeed part of the limbic system, and they regulate emotion, the fight or flight response, memory, and of course they're associated with the brain reward system. They're also involved with stress, and we will discuss that more in depth. Hippocampus, that we have just already discussed, the name itself has to do with the seahorse. That's kind of the shape, right? And it's part of the largest structure, the hippocampal formation, and it has to do, again, as we just mentioned, with memory, as well as learning, perception of space, and navigation. This is essential for the ones of you that are visual learners, right? And you receive from the cerebral cortex. There is information from the cerebral cortex, and of course, because it has to do with memory as well, it plays an essential role in the understanding of Alzheimer's disease. Ventricles and cerebrospinal fluids that we already mentioned that are fundamental because the CFS washes out waste impurities and has to do with the delivery of nutrients. And the structure is created by the ventricle. So the ventricle manufacture the CSF. And it's very, very important if we want to understand, yet again, it's beneath the arachnoid layer of the meninges. We could really spend all day, but maybe one of the things that I would like to add is the pineal gland, which regulates the circadian rhythm, the sleep-wake cycle, because it's important both from a neurophysiological, neuroanatomical perspective, but also because it's responds to light and dark and secretes melatonin. So why is it so important? Well, because everything comes together and all these parts communicate. Now, when we think about the sleep-wake cycle, when we think about melatonin, for instance, and our internal clock, our circadian rhythm, we also think about awareness and presence. Now, everything comes together in a sense that, for instance, when we think about stress response, which we will discuss more in depth, the stress response is also related to how we interpret those signals and how we monitor the signals over time. And that's precisely what studying memories and study the reward system in the brain is so essential to understand how trauma can be perpetrated in the future. And that's precisely why therapeutic methodologies that are predicated upon this progressive exposure connect with the reinterpretation of the trauma. So those are all things I want to bring to your attention. One more thing, perhaps, that we should also touch upon when we connect the central part of the brain, the limbic system, etc., to the cortex, is the fact that not single part of the brain is completely independent, and yet each part of the brain does its own thing very specifically. And in order to understand that, I always want to understand how to bridge the gap between function, structure, and perception. Example, frontal lobes, okay? And one of the most horrifying things that unfortunately psychiatry performed in decades back, lobotomy, okay? And by lobotomy, we think of frontal lobes. This idea that removing a part of the brain that was associated with XYZ for now could improve the behavior of the person. Now, the question is always, from an ethical perspective, when we want to change someone's behavior, we want to quote unquote brainwash them or change something about them, neuroanatomically speaking? Do we do this to help them become a better version of themselves, to free themselves from obstacles, or we do that to make our own life easier because their behavior is not either socially acceptable or it bothers us? We will discuss this more in depth when we talk about clinical psychology, but whatever we do to the brain, there's always an ethical question of why are we doing certain things, okay? So frontal lobes and changes in behavior, perception, and emotion. The example that I would like you to study on your own is the example of Phineas Gage. Now, this name will be with you hopefully for the remainder of the semester. Phineas Gage, because he is one of our Great Mountain States Vermont heroes, all right? He is one of the first examples of neuroanatomical and, I guess, unwanted neurosurgery that really brought new knowledge to the field. So I will add another video about Phineas Gage and the really fascinating story behind his horrible accident, which occurred in Cavendish, Vermont, in the railway of Cavendish, Vermont. It was a humongous explosion that really punctured his brain, his frontal lobes, with this metal rod that really punctured him, and it was a horrible accident, but he was able to survive, and none of his kind of lower functions, including deambulation, gait, was that affected, but his personality changed, his emotion changed a lot. And the rod, the original rod, is still visible at the History Museum in St. Albans, Vermont. So if you travel to St. Albans, or if you live there, or if you go to the college there, then please take a look, go up the hill, go to the History Museum, and on the second floor, I believe, on the right side, the second door, you go all the way to the very end of the first corridor, you see the rods of Phineas Gage, and there's a whole story about him. But that was one example where the debate between structure and function was brought together, because not only the brain could survive and make up for significant missing part of the brain, the person would survive seemingly as well as before the accident, but with significant changes in the specific areas of the brain monitored by this emotion, behavior, etc., etc. Now, there's a lot of discussion about Phineas Gage as a person, and there's a lot of accounts that actually indicate that his behavior improved over time. So he became more violent and inappropriate right after the accident, but eventually, many accounts indicated this did not last forever. He came back to his old self, which is also a very nurturing thing to consider from a neuroanatomical and clinical psychology perspective, because it really gives us the impression that with very few exceptions, the brain tends to bounce back very well, all things considered, and also the fact that therapy makes significant impact on the person, because you can always come back from trauma, from some of the most horrible emotional, as well as the name implies, as this example implies, very harsh physical traumas. His brain, I believe, is still conserved to this day at Harvard University. But anyway, Phineas Gage, Vermont hero, look at the video below, and if you have the chance to go in person to St. Albans, to the History Museum, I really encourage you to do that. All right, something that is added. Let me just take a look at the quiz to make sure that I don't miss anything here. All right, a few more things. Let's see what time it is. All right, just a few more things. When we talk about the brain, we also talk about senses, and we've already seen that most of our senses are located in very specific areas of the brain, and yet there are certain senses that, so to speak, dominate. All right, they dominate in a way that they have more power, strength, but also speed and function in comparison to the rest. So, for instance, multiple studies have indicated that in this day and age, we really rely on two main senses. One that really dominates, and it's vision. So vision really dominates. Just think about what we're doing now. So whether you are in the real world or the digital or virtual world, seeing things is the most stimulating and sometimes, unfortunately, overstimulating things we experience. Even when we talk about photosensitivity or light noise at night, it's a huge difference in experiential terms between living downtown Manhattan, for instance, or in the middle of the woods in Vermont, for instance, where you don't have so much light noise, especially at night. And not only that, but our visual understanding is still the one that dominates in advertisement industry, entertainment industry, and everyday life. Vision really dominates, followed by audio sensory stimulation. So hearing is what follows, okay? Just think about things such as music, for instance, or jingles or podcasts. We rely a lot of our sensory information on hearing after vision. Now you might wonder, okay, so what are the perceptual modalities that are not as nurtured nowadays? Well, tactile experiences, for instance, are not as nurtured nowadays, and this has a very negative effect. We will talk more about that when we explore clinical psychology elements, but just the very fact that we tend to be quite separated from one another, despite of cultural differences. I'm from Central and Southern Europe, and Italians tend to be very touchy-feely, very close to one another. But there's no clinical psychology talk that is quite effective as a hug, for example, physical touch. Now, there's a lot of things that we should consider here, because you cannot just go around, and hug random people, unless you're in Italy, in which case it's perfectly fine. And because this can also be triggering, especially in the context of PTSD or CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But nevertheless, tactile experiences, touch, is quite left behind the back burner nowadays in comparison to vision and hearing. And I'm very skeptical of certain form of therapy that creates this, for lack of a better term, I must say, fake touch proximity, fake tactile experiences such as hug therapy, touch therapy. I'm very, very skeptical, because the missing element is the truth. If a touch is rehearsed, that itself can create a problem on a more subconscious level. So we'll touch upon that later. But if you have a person whom you trust, whom you love, and carries the weight of your suffering, of holding your hand, of touching you, that is itself extremely healing. Why is that? I mentioned this before. Well, it's also due to neurological structure right here in the parietal lobe, because yet again, sounding a little repetitive here. Light, touch, temperature, and pain, okay, they're all modulated by the parietal lobe, but a light, warm, nurturing, loving touch can't override pain, okay? Whether you're hurting yourself, just like this, you add some pressure, you're touching it, that's a healing element. Now, I'm not talking about healing touch as a complementary alternative medicine modality, which is to some extent a misnomer, because you're not actually touching the person. The assumption is that you're modulating either the ethereal body or their auras. I don't want to touch upon that, no pun intended, but physical touch is healing. So it's really unfortunate we don't spend enough time understanding that. And that's precisely why these experiences here are not the same as the real experience. You're missing that. Now, two senses are left. Well, two neurologically modulated senses in a way that we usually see that, those five senses, right? Where can I write them? And I'll put it here together: taste plus smell, because there are two siblings. In fact, you don't need a lot of neuroscientific knowledge to know that if you cannot smell something, things do not taste as well, all right? Think about our recent pandemic with COVID, and if you have some olfactory problem, the food didn't really taste much, or at least it did not taste as good as before. It did not taste as good, also it did not taste as well. So good as an adjective, well as an adverb, because you did not taste it. Tasting element was missing, right? Because the smelling part was missing. Or the opposite, because there is a modulation, and there are other studies that really indicate that it's through taste that the smell is stimulated and vice versa, right? Because of their receptor. Then those two senses also play an essential role. They're also the backburner, so to speak, but there are some very basic and yet complex chemical elements to take into account. I will not dig too deep into this for now, but if you remember, everything about neurotransmission is electric at first, actual potential, and then eventually chemical, and vice versa, because it's due to the different in membrane potential that all those sodium and potassium cations actually move around, right, in the membrane. And so the chemistry, the chemical composition is actually real. So when someone is saying that falling in love is having chemistry, well, they're not really off. That's really what the science indicates, and should not be viewed in a cold-hearted way, as in a way to minimize how important love is. In fact, love is the guiding principle of everything neuroscientific and psychologically. The taste of smell, the taste of smell. That was interesting. The sense of taste and the sense of smell are an integral part of how we make sense of the world. Even more so when we think about the olfactory bulb, okay? Olfactory bulb. And the sense of olfaction in general, think of this. This is one of the most primordial senses, okay, olfaction in general, that really give us a lot of extra information. Now think about developmental pathophysiology, developmental psychology, human growth and development. Think about other animals, okay, especially mammals, how they interact by smelling one another and then tasting really one another, and how their sense of taste and smell is really enhanced in comparison to us human beings, but also how you can get to appreciate certain foods, for instance. Foods become familiar to you, they remind you of something, okay? And the same thing as the taste of someone's lips, if you're kissing them, if you love them, if you feel nurtured, how these two are really connected. The sense of olfaction is one of the most ancient primordial senses, and also the one that almost completely bypasses this structure to be sent to the cortex. So while every other sense, for the most part, had to go through a lot of encoding, analysis, amplification to be understood, all other senses, this sense of olfaction almost goes through like a train, and it brings you to a different state of mind, literally speaking. And this is true. Just think about how your mood can change if you're walking on a random day, random afternoon, say downtown, and you smell those very, or what you think those are the very cookies or cake that your grandma baked when you were a child, for instance, okay? And you really brought to this state of mind of peace, calmness. You quiet your soul, so to speak, and you feel this coziness, right? This hygge, we would say in Danish, this sense of proximity. The opposite, when you have a very bad smell, that might be extremely triggering to you, and you feel nauseated existentially almost. You feel physically nauseated, but also existentially nauseated. And this is connected to what we said in week one, the term illness, ill, the term evil, and the German term evil, okay, as nausea, nauseated, are connected. So this existential disgust, okay, this existential nausea for life, it's connected to this sense as well. Or at least it's triggered by that, and that can turn into a variety of other things. One of the most common examples is, unfortunately, the sense of smell of the skin or body odor, even if it's not really a stinky body odor, but the smell of a specific person, when this person either betrayed you, abused you physically, emotionally, sexually, etc. And that smell is really, really hard to remove because that is connected to what we said earlier about hippocampal structure and memory production and retrieval, right? The sense of smell is really, really hard to remove. So you do understand that up here, cognitively speaking, you're not unsafe. You are removed from the trauma, but the smell can really bring you back. But the opposite is true as well, and that's why aromatherapy is an essential part of psychotherapy, okay? Despite of the label of alternate still. The research clearly indicates that olfaction plays a major role in the preservation and rehearsal of memories and the way memories are stored in the brain on both sides, so the good and the bad. Because again, it's not analyzed, you brought back to that. And even if you don't have any specific smells, I should mention that, because all the examples I gave you so far have to do with smells that you can recognize as specific smells, right? These are the cookies, this is the smell of the skin, this is cigarettes, this is the smell of gasoline, whatever it is. You can recognize, remember, you can associate a label, a term, a word, a concept to the smell. But in mental health, change of seasons are as well as important. Think about seasonal affective disorders. Now, I'm not claiming here that SAD, seasonal affective disorder, is entirely predicated on olfaction. I'm not making that statement. But you experience, I'm sure, a different mood when, for instance, you smell wet grass after rain, or when you almost sense that it's about to snow. Now, if you live in Vermont, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's constantly triggering smell of snow. I love snow, by the way. Nothing against the winter season. Or you sense something different when summer comes. Now, if you combine olfaction with temperature and pain, quantitative study also indicate that we react differently if we are super hot or super cold. In the first case, we tend to be, in general, a little bit overreacting to things, in a variety of things, some of which are good, some of which are bad. And in the second case, we are a little subdued, we're underreacting. I'm not sure how much scientific evidence there is to this, but one joke I always say is that that's precisely why in Scandinavia you can find a lot of black metal, gothic metal, Viking metal bands, but you don't find as many, let's say, reggae ensembles there. You find them more in warmer areas. But jokes aside, olfaction and sensory stimulation is essential to our understanding of life. So I will add one more video if you're interested in olfaction, and this has to do with a research that my team and I have done over the years, and it's connected to olfactory virtual reality, and its application in neuroscience, psychiatry, and mental health in general. So if you are interested in that, I will not spend too much time. As part of this video, I would encourage you to take a look at that research. Let's see. Great. So, okay, emotion. And I think that is pretty much it for this lecture. Now, one other thing I want to mention is this, just because some of you mentioned that. What's the best way to study for this course? Reviewing the lectures, having the chance to rehearse some of the parts of the brain, so quiz yourself, okay? Create a diagram that, just like this, is almost, this is not really blank, but with the least possible amount of information, and add information, names, functions, where it's located, what type of interaction with the other area of the brain they have, and make sense of things. Okay. Also, the ones that the students that are enrolled in the course have also extra added materials, diagram, etc. So please use that as guidelines. Okay. Also, you will see that the quizzes are always a means, a pathway toward knowledge. So they're structured in a way to stimulate further learning. Don't view them as hard tests, but mostly as challenges to ameliorate your knowledge. So try to put things together. One more note about the final project, also in regard to some of the emails that I received. again, the final project is really the final paper, all right? So yes, you can choose pretty much any topic you like as long as they have some connection with psychology, which yet again, it's really hard to find anything in the world that has completely no connection with psychology as a field. So you can rely on the lectures, the videos, the admin materials, the textbook, if you purchase a textbook, and try to make sense of things. I'll be happy to guide you in regard to what type of resources, scientific peer-reviewed literature, or anything else I can do. So I would like to stop here for today. There's quite a bit of materials to cover. And this was the second lecture about the brain function, neuroanatomy. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me those questions either via email, at the faculty email posted on our module, or you can just comment below. Thank you very much, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.